Isn't it grand to be a Christian? And isn't it grand and wonderful to be a part of the family that meets here at Concord Street? I am so thankful that you are here. I am thankful that we have the opportunity to be together, to worship God this morning, to sing these songs of praise. I appreciate in Chris and leading our singing. He is a pinch hitter this morning because Brother Bert's voice was not there. And so we just had to go down the list of relievers. But thankfully, Chris did a wonderful job, and we appreciate his passion in leading our singing and your passion also in singing out and worshiping. And so it is definitely grand to be here and grand to be a Christian this morning. In case you did not know, today is Mother's Day. And if you did not know that, then you are probably in trouble. But happy Mother's Day. We are so thankful for our mothers, and we're thankful for whether they be physical mothers or they be spiritual mothers in the faith that have helped raise us and bring us up. And so we thank you. We honor you today, and we also try to honor you at other times. But definitely happy Mother's Day to you. So in our Sunday morning sermons, we've been talking about the Gospel of Mark. And in talking about this Gospel, one of the themes that we have seen throughout it is this idea of being cruciformed. And this is the type of culture that we want to try to develop here at Concord Street, is a cruciform culture, a culture that is shaped, that is formed, that follows after the cross of Jesus. And as you go through the Gospel of Mark, that is what this entire story, this great story, this good news is all about. It's about Jesus moving towards the cross, about Him taking this band of disciples with Him and moving them towards the cross. And eventually we'll get to chapter 8, where we even have the verse that we have up here on the side of the wall, about how that if you truly want to be a follower of Jesus, then you need to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow after Him. Because a life with Jesus is a life that goes to the cross. And that is what we want to be shaped by. But what is interesting as we go throughout the Gospel of Mark is that the disciples, especially the disciples that we oftentimes think about, the Matthew and the Peter and the James and the John and all those others that we know their names of, they aren't the best disciples. They don't do a great job of following Jesus sometimes. There's different times that we will try to show their high points, but throughout the gospel, more than often, you see their low points. You see their confusion. You see their denseness. You see how Jesus seems to have just laid it out so clearly to them, and they go, huh? And they don't understand it. But what's interesting is maybe Mark is also using this as a literary device known as a foil. A foil is a character or an event that is presented to cause a contrast with what we really want to be. And this morning, in honor of Mother's Day, and just thinking about whether you're a mother or not, one thing that all mothers have in common is they're all women. That's not very popular to say nowadays. But one thing all mothers have in common is that they are all women. And one thing Mark does throughout his gospel is he shows you the value of a woman. In fact, what we're going to find out as we go throughout the Gospel of Mark, we're going to jump all over the place this morning. We're not going to stop just at one text. We'll be at the beginning, we'll be at the end, we'll be at the middle, we'll be all kinds of places. So be ready to turn to those places. But what we find out is in the Gospel of Mark is that the women portray or are portrayed as models of discipleship in action. And when I think about mothers, mothers are women in action. Bless you. I know you're tired. Please sit down. Definitely, they are women. The women are portrayed, at least in the Gospel of Mark and other places too, but we're going to focus on Mark this morning. They're portrayed as models of discipleship. So many times we look at the actual disciples that we think about, the male disciples, and Mark is saying, don't be like that. But then he brings up the women, and he holds them at a high and lofty place and says, act more like them. So this morning we'll look at 3 different ways that women, the value of women is seen as they model discipleship for us and what we can all strive to be more like. The first thing I want you to notice is that women disciples model service. Women disciples model service. If you are a disciple, then you must be about service. Let's notice some of the women that are portrayed as women of service. Turn first off to Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1. We're going to look at the very beginning of Mark, and we're going to look at the very end of Mark. And I don't know if Mark does this on purpose or this happens to be a coincidence, but we have bookend with the first chapter of Mark and the last chapter of Mark, women of service. Look what happens there in Mark chapter 1 and in verse 31. It says, so he came and took her by the hand. This is referring to Peter's mother-in-law. He took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately her fever left her. And notice what she does. And she served them. Here we have a room full of disciples. Here we have a room full of people, some of those that were just mentioned earlier in chapter 1 that Jesus had just called to follow him. But in this room, where all those disciples are, there is only one that is said to be about service. And that is the one that was just had a fever that was at the point of death. But the first thing she does as she is saved, as she is healed, if you will, she is saved to serve. That's an example of what we should be as disciples. When we have put on Christ in baptism, when we have been saved from this fever of sin, if you will, that is leading to our death, we are saved for the purpose of serving. And that's exactly what this woman does. All right, let's jump to the end of the Gospel of Mark. Look at Mark in chapter 16 and in verse 1. Mark in chapter 16 and in verse 1. Give you the context. This is Jesus has died. He has been in the tomb. This is now the Lord's Day, as we refer to it. This is now Sunday, the first day of the week. Verse 1 says, now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices that they might come and anoint him. Notice who is at the tomb. Notice who is still coming to serve. Notice that even in their grief, they realize that service still needs to be rendered. Even in their upsetness, even in their loss, they realize that they must continue to serve. The disciples aren't there, but the women are there to serve. And if that does not describe the type of woman that we are supposed to model after, then I don't know what is. When you think about just mothers in general, I think about my wife as a mother, I think about my own mother, and guess what? No matter what is going on, guess what they're going to continue to do? Be in service. Even if it's a bad day, even if things aren't going great, even if there is grief involved, they continue to serve. Let this be a model to all of us as disciples. Follow the example of these valuable women that we should be about service. They model discipleship in their service. Second thing, and if you're keeping notes, this will be easy because it starts with another S. Women, okay? Women disciples model seeking. Women disciples model seeking. Turn over to Mark chapter 5. Let's look at our first example of this. Mark and in chapter 5. And we'll do a full lesson on this narrative at some other time. But look what is said there starting in verse 25. Mark chapter 5 and in verse 25. It says, "Now a certain woman," I think it's interesting also, I'll just stop there for a second, is that most of these women that we're talking about, one thing they have in common is they don't have names. You may remember what Peter's mother-in-law's name was? I mean, I'm sure Peter remembered, but we don't know it. This woman here, do we know what her name is? No, we don't. We are given the name of the women at the end of the Gospel of Mark, but that is for a purpose. That is for a purpose because those people that first read Mark knew of those women, and they could go and talk to them, and those women could be eyewitnesses of the events that took place. But the rest of these women are nameless. They're anonymous. But their example continues to speak on even if we don't know their name. Look what it says there in verse 25. "Now a certain woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians, she spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, 'If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well.'" Jump to verse 32, the same chapter. "He looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction.'" There's so many things that are going on there, and there's some cultural things that we need to maybe try to unpack at another time. But this woman who had this flow of blood, this woman who had this ailment, this woman who had been through so many terrible things because of it, one thing that she also had was uncleanness. She was ceremonially unclean. According to the law, she should not be in a crowd, much less trying to grab somebody. But she is seeking after Jesus. So she is undeterred. She boldly goes into that crowd. She faithfully, it says there in those words, not only does Jesus say that your faith has made you well, but earlier she had the thought in her mind, if just I can touch the hem of his garment, if I can just touch just the tip of his prayer shawl, if you will, then I believe that I can be healed. She was seeking after Jesus. Not let these things get in her way of seeking faithfully after him. Turn over a couple of chapters. Look at Mark chapter 7 now. Mark chapter 7. And this time in verse 24. It says, "From there he arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon." And now notice this. "And he entered a house and wanted no one to know it." Okay? So Jesus is trying to get a break here. He's in an area, he's entered a house, and he wants basically to be alone. He wants no one to know it, but he could not be hidden. Why couldn't he be hidden? Because there's a woman that is seeking after him. Look what it says. "For," giving a reason why he could not be hidden, "for a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him. She came and fell at his feet. And the woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth." Now notice this. "And she kept asking." A better translations, she kept begging. She didn't stop. She continued. She continued. She begged and she begged and she begged. But Jesus said to her, "Let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take from the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For this saying, go your way, the demon has gone out of your daughter." Notice that this woman, persistent, she was not going to take no for an answer because she had her family that she was caring about. She had a daughter at home. This mother had a daughter at home that was being tormented, that was being tortured by this demon. And she wanted that child to be made well. And she knew that the person to make her well was that Jesus. And so she models discipleship because she is not deterred. She is not turned away. In fact, intellectually, she makes a comment. She turns the phrase back on Jesus to make the point that even she, as a Syrophoenician woman, as a Greek, as a Gentile, as one of the nations, can also receive the blessings that come with Jesus. But what a model of discipleship. So many times we have the other disciples who let small little excuses get in the way of seeking after Jesus. But not this woman. That is why these women are models of discipleship. Look at one other account. This time, towards the end of the Gospel of Mark, look at Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15. So Mark 15 is the crucifixion story, right? We have Jesus. He is on the cross. He is dying on the cross. He is depicted as basically being all alone, except for the other two criminals that flank his left side and his right side. But look what it says there in verse 40. It says, "There were also women looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less, and of Joseph and Salome." Now again, remember, the reason why their names are mentioned is because so later on when people are reading this gospel and go, well, I want to go talk to Mary about this. And they could do just that. But he says, look at verse 41 now. "Who also followed him and ministered to him. And when he was in Galilee, many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem." All three of these terms are terms of discipleship. Who are the followers of Jesus? It's supposed to be the disciples of Jesus. But where are the disciples? They're not there. Who are supposed to be the ministers unto Jesus? It's supposed to be the disciples, but they're not there. Who are the ones that came up from Galilee who were called, "You follow me"? It's the disciples, but they're not there. But these women are. In fact, it's so interesting as you go through the things that precede all of this. You think about it, that earlier on in chapter 14, you have that Judas is going to betray Jesus, and we see him doing just that. You see that the other disciples have all scattered, right? They've all fled. They've all run away. You have Peter, who has even said, "Even if I have to die, I will not deny you. I will never leave your side." But that same Peter was sitting by a fire and let a little girl make him with cursings and with pleas say, "I do not know the man." Judas has betrayed him. The disciples have fled from him. Peter has denied him. But the women seek him still. That just shows you how important this model of discipleship, that disciples seek after Jesus. Mark has shown us that all the males, all the ones we expect to be the leaders, all the ones that we expect that we're supposed to follow after, they have run with their tails tucked in and run away. But the women are there. How awesome. Just think about in your own life. We oftentimes think about a preacher or a teacher and those type of things, but the women. What about the woman that helped you find Jesus? What about the woman that continues to seek after Jesus? This morning, You as women, whether you be a wife or whether you be a mother or whether you be a sister, whatever, continue to seek after Jesus. It makes an impact. It makes a difference. Seek Him. Thirdly, I want you to notice that women disciples model sacrifice. They model sacrifice. Again, when I think about words that would describe a mother, sacrifice is a word that helps encapsulate what a mother's job is, what a mother's role is. It's one of sacrifice. Sacrifice of time, sacrifice of sleep, sacrifice of privacy, sacrifice of doing what they want to do, all for the sake of those others that they are in care of. Well, we see that there is other women in the Gospel of Mark that are shown as being disciples in their sacrifice. Turn back to Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. Jesus has spent some time talking about the scribes, talking about the people who show their religiosity, but who in fact are not actually religious. People that are doing these different things for show, and he is talking about that. But then in verse 41 it says, "Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much." That's not necessarily bad. He's not saying that that is bad. But notice what he goes on to say. "Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites," which makes a quatrain. "So he called his disciples to himself." Notice what he does in verse 43. His disciples, the ones that are supposed to be the example, he calls his disciples to himself and says, "Hey guys, look at that. That's what I want you to be like." A poor widow? No, not just a poor widow, but someone who is willing to sacrifice. My entire life, Jesus has been trying to teach them, and through all of his teachings, it's about sacrifice, it's about service, it's about going to the cross, it's about giving up your life for others. And they haven't got it yet, but maybe they can look at that poor widow that's been over, who is giving her entire livelihood to God. Be like that. That's the model of discipleship. That's how you are supposed to sacrifice. Look what he says actually in the text. "Surely I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all of those who have given to the treasury." What? All those other rich people that gave so much, but she gives so little, and yet she gives more? What do you mean, Jesus? Well, he'll go on to explain this. "For they put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood." Or maybe another way, all that she had to live on. It becomes an example of she put in her life. That's what disciples do. Take up your cross and follow after me. Put in your life. And that's the example she gives. Let's look at one more example. Look over the passage that was read by Elijah a little bit ago. Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. Starting in verse 3. Another example of sacrifice says, "And being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came having an alabaster flask of very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask." Okay? It's not like she could just use part of it. She had to use it all. She broke the flask and she poured it on his head. But there were some who were indignant, the disciples, among themselves, and said, "Why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they criticized her sharply. What's interesting is later on in the same narrative that one of the disciples that is there is going to be a disciple that instead of anointing Jesus, with money, if you will. He is going to take money to betray Jesus. But not this woman. A woman, we don't know her name. We don't know her name, but look at the memorial for her. But Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. You have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good, but me you do not have always. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Surely I say to you, wherever this good news, wherever this gospel is proclaimed, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as memorial to her. Women have done things. They are working. They are doing. The other disciples are standing around criticizing and complaining. The other disciples are not doing what they're supposed to do, but yet this woman walks in and she has done the good thing. This woman walks in and she has done what she could. This woman has done what she needed to do to show her sacrifice. 300 denarii, by the way, is basically a year's salary spent in a moment, but spent on the Messiah. Something you may miss there. Remember, what does the name Messiah mean? Anointed. What happens here? He is anointed. He is proclaimed by this woman as the Messiah, and that he has anointed her. Hopefully you've been able to see through these examples the great value of a woman. So I've talked a lot to the women, but now let's think about the men for a second. Men, if there is a woman in your life that models these things, encourage her, help her, love her, give everything you can to hold her up as a person of value, as a person that we should strive to follow after. Take that as your example. See the service. See the seeking. See the sacrifice. And then do likewise. For the rest of the women, whether you find yourself as a mother, you find yourself as a wife, or you find yourself as a single person or as a daughter, wherever you find yourself, realize that there is great value in you in the Lord's church. You can do great things. You know, so many times when we think about Christianity and we think about the church and we think about the role of women, and there's so many things that can be said about that, and so many times you have this dichotomy, if you will, that the men can do this, but the women can do nothing. Is that what Mark says here? Definitely not. And I want to remind you that you may not in a public setting stand behind a pulpit, but you can sure stand by a cross. And you can show how that you will be of service, that you will seek after Jesus, and that you will sacrifice for Him. You may not ever, as far as the Lord's church is concerned, we think about the different roles and positions, right? There's the position of an elder. There's the position of a deacon. And the Scripture is very, very clear about who should hold those positions. But you need to realize that though you may not ever have a position of elder or of deacon, you can have a purpose in the Lord's church by being a model of discipleship in how you serve and seek and sacrifice. You may never have a leading role in the way that we think about that men have a leading role, but you can sure lead in your love that you show through your service, through your seeking, and through your sacrifice. I am so thankful this morning that when Jesus came to this earth to live and die, He didn't just do it for the men. He did it for the women also. In fact, when you look throughout the gospel is something that is totally countercultural of all the things that are going on in the first century, because it puts them at their proper place of exaltation. Because these people of humility, of humble service, they too are exalted. That's where Paul can say later on in Galatians chapter 3 that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, but we are all one in Christ Jesus. And the way that you can become a Christian is the same way that these women became Christians, is that they were willing to serve the Lord. They sought after Him. They sacrificed of their life. We maybe call it different things, but we call that seeking belief, faith. We call that sacrifice repentance. We call that service where you are willing to submit to Him in baptism, denying yourself, taking up your own cross, being buried with Him in a tomb of baptism, and rising to walk in newness of life. And just like Peter's mother-in-law, who was saved, she was saved to serve. And that's what we all ought to do too. The reason why the women are so valuable in Mark is because they were purchased with the blood of Christ. The reason why each and every one of you has value is not because of what is in your bank account, is not because of what letters you may find after your name and degrees. It's not because of your social or economical status. It's not because of a skin color. It's not because of what you have done or what you will do. It's because you were worth the blood of Christ. And there is great value in that. What a great day, Mother's Day. But what would make this even a greater day is for you to submit to the Father. I think it's interesting that we don't know what those women's names were so many times. But it's interesting what Jesus calls at least one of those women, daughter. Come and be a part of the family by being born again. But for the rest of us that already are Christians, look at the models of discipleship. Don't do what the disciples did. Do what the women did in service, in seeking, and in sacrifice. Is there anyone to help you this morning? Please come as we stand and sing.